Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for attending our International Food Symposium this afternoon. We're almost all accounted for. We had a little transportation glitch, but I think we can get started and move on to today. So I want to say welcome to all our colleagues here that are presenting over the next day and a half. Katie Sampak, if you haven't met her yet. And I would like to warmly welcome all of you to our two universities, Illinois Wesleyan University and Illinois State University, to all of our colleagues that have traveled across the globe to come here today to share their exciting ideas with us. So, just a little bit for students, when Columbus arrived on the island of Wanahani in the West Indies, little could he have known that imagine his own role in launching the world's first global network of trade. One of the major shifts that continues to reverberate today revolves around food exchanges. The Columbian Exchange, as it's known, that is the widespread transfer of foodstuffs, plants, animals, and with them culture, technology, unfortunately human exchanges, often in the form of slavery and disease. These exchanges between the Americas, West Africa, the old world in the 15th and 16th century is indeed the point of departure for this conference. This afternoon and tomorrow, experts in their respective fields will discuss specific food practices such as early modern poultry farming and the birth of commercial networks in the New World, beef jerky plantations and their connections with capitalism and slavery systems, the coffee market and intersections of Mayan smallholder farmers in Guatemala and symbolic values produced around specialty coffees in the U.S. today, Latin American cacao production and stakeholders in a cacao chocolate supply chain. Other scholars will share with us representations of food in literary texts. Food is an identifying marker in the construction of race and national identities, food's role in the construction of gender. To this last point, two different scholars will bring to the symposium their contributions of food's role in one, authoritarian discourse and how it functioned as a potent biopolitical tool in Francoist Spain, and how gender dimensions of culinary celebrity play out in early 20th century Barcelona. Tomorrow's session will finish with understanding more deeply how policymakers and developmental organizations negotiate shared powers, shared histories and power relations, and some of the results of the neoliberalization of food systems. And this very afternoon, we have the privilege of listening to Dr. Earle's keynote on the Spanish Cultural Colonial Project and how cannibalism and the Eucharist were so intricately linked in the fashion of New World spaces. So students that are here today, feel free to have a seat, and it's okay to get up and leave later.
I didn't want to get
It'll be okay. Come on. I invite you to think critically and creatively about what you hear this afternoon and in tomorrow's sessions. Consider how ideas presented here align with other things that you're learning in the classes, or perhaps other changing climate events you've attended while here. And please take advantage to reach out to our scholars who are here with us today. Introduce yourselves and share with them what you're working on here or at Illinois State. It's never too early to begin networking, so don't be shy. And then before I introduce our provost, Mark Brodel, I want to thank the supporters for Thoughtful Food in the Luso-Hispanic Transatlantic. First of all, it is part of this year's intellectual theme, which is changing climates, that Professor Tom Lutzy in our history department has so seamlessly organized. And I want to also thank those who made this conference symposium possible with their generous support. First, at Illinois State University, the SAGE Foundation, Sociology and Anthropology Department, the Office of International Studies and Programs, Latin American and Latinx Studies, the Department of Languages and Literatures, and the History Department. Lots of love there. And from Illinois Wesleyan, the Byron S. Tucci Endowed Lecture Series, the Department of Hispanic Studies, International Studies, also on this campus, particularly the Latin American Studies and the Western European Studies groups, through Political Science Department and Sociology and Anthropology Department. And I'd like to extend a very special and personal thanks to our student assistant, Kelly Hyland. Kelly is a senior marketing major and Hispanic studies minor, and over these past few months has worked tirelessly on every single detail of this symposium. Her graphic design and marketing skills have been key in our promotional materials, everything from the conference poster to the blog. Let me get that on the screen for you. Let's see. There you go. Everything from our conference poster to the blog that she designed, our programs that we have here today, and even our menu design tonight that those conference presenters will appreciate. Katie and I would never have managed without the level of excellence that Kelly brought to organizing this symposium. So I'd like to just pause for a moment and give her a round of applause. And I'll pass the mic then to our provost and dean of the faculty, Michael.
Pass the mic.
Yeah. So now you can hold on to this guy.
All right. So hello everyone, and I want to welcome you to Illinois Wesleyan University. It is truly great to have you here. And from all of us here and our collaborators at Illinois State, thank you for coming to Bloomington Normal to share in this. I'm honored to have the opportunity to get you started on what looks like to be a remarkable couple of days. Chewing on some, sorry, there's more to come, some intriguing perspectives and thoughts about food. Although certainly it's not the case for some of the major swaths of the human population. First world populations often take food for granted. We expect it to be readily available, to be delicious, indescribably so, if at all possible. We talk over it. And we come to make history-making business and political decisions while dining at very powerful tables. Food can mobilize armies and organize humanitarian efforts of massive scale. Individual, community, and national identities are built and shaped around food and the cuisines that we enjoy. Thinking about food as a driver or a catalyst for history and human interactions is far more than a delicious intellectual exercise. It informs us about what is yet to come and also how we can better our lives. This is an important meeting for those reasons. The meeting agenda, or should I say menu, is tantalizing. It offers up dishes from linguists, historians, archaeologists, literary scholars, sociologists, and political scientists. You've traveled from all over the globe, from Australia, Colombia, Brazil, and England, and from across the United States, literally from Seattle to North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Boston to Tennessee, Texas, and California. There are local contributions as well from IWU faculty member William Monroe, and who's in political science here, and one alum, Emmy Grace, from the class of 2011, who double majored in environmental studies in Spanish, and then went on to earn a master's degree in international affairs and national resources and sustainability from development from American University. She then spent years in Guatemala working in economic development there, bringing with her the power of her interdisciplinary training. This symposium furthers that power of interdisciplinarity brought about by the convergence of disciplines. You will gain new and rich insights that will point in new directions for future work. As the elaboration and meaning of different cuisines helps to shape identities, I also hope that this meeting's mix of interdisciplinary perspectives opens new directions for you as scholars. In that context, I too might even have a seat at this table. I am by training a plant biologist, and my research has focused on plant responses to high temperature. In particular, my students have looked at how the process of protein secretion in cereal grains, things like we use barley and rice and corn as model systems, how the process of protein secretion is affected by heat stress. The ability for plants to secrete proteins from one cell to produce effects on neighboring cells is fundamental to key transitions in plant development, such as germination, pollination, and ripening. And high temperature shuts down these secretory processes by damaging the cellular machinery that is needed for secretion. You can easily imagine why plant biologists are concerned about climate change and its impact on our food supply. Addressing the biological effects of climate change will require insights and approaches from a wide range of disciplines: climatologists, computationalists, cell biologists, chemists, engineers, geneticists, physicists, plant breeders, the list goes on and on. The problem, however, extends well beyond the technological. There are human dimensions at play in how we address this challenge of climate that we just begin to explore. Furthermore, climate change is but one of the several grand challenges that face us. The future also includes challenges in energy, equal access, health, income disparities, otherness. The list is lengthy. And again, we've only scratched the surface of the human dimensions of these challenges. I will add that each of these grand challenges, there are also dimensions where food plays a very significant role. And in thinking about those dimensions, thought for food will keep you, as well as other scholars in the future, busy for a lifetime yet to come. I won't keep you from that work, and it's great to have you at Illinois Wesleyan University. Thank you. The first session.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm going to simply introduce the speakers for the first session. Each will speak, and then I have asked that we reserve about 15 minutes at the end of the panel so that we can have questions then. So I will introduce all of them now and let them come up individually to work on the images and their talks. Our first speaker will be Professor Ana Maria Gomez Bravo, who's a professor of Spanish at the University of Washington. Her most recent book is Food and Culture in the Hispanic World. She's presently researching the relation between food and ethnic identity, exploring inquisitorial records that profile the food practices of Jews, Muslims, and other minorities. So she will be speaking on food and the idea of raza in late medieval and early modern Spain. Our second speaker is Gregorio Escobar, professor of Spanish. His most recent work is on the presence of indigenous workers in colonial sugarcane mills, published in the Ana Estudio Paulista. Before that, he researched the enforced use of wheat in colonial production. He'll be speaking about the introduction of poultry farming. And our third speaker will be Amy Tickner, professor of English at the University of Texas, Arlington. She most recently co-authored a book on literature and food studies. She's currently working on other aspects of transnational food production, including today's discussion of Iberian recipes in 17th century English manuscripts. So please welcome our first speaker, Professor Gomez Bravo.
It's loud. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm going to be talking today about food and no, I have to hold it.
Oh, no, it's not going to be a little louder.
Okay. I'm trying to have my hands free. I don't know if this is going to work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
My project is on food and the development of an idea of raza or race. I use the word raza, which is usually translated as race in English. The reason why I like to use the Spanish is because it has a different development as word and as a concept from English. I'm going to be referring to that a little bit. Basically, what I'm saying is that the beginning of race in Spanish develops as a fault rather than a lineage, and that that fault is related to ideas of religious ideas, mostly on the understanding of baptism, how a person becomes Christian. Also to ideas of the body, so I'm using a lot of medical theory to see how the body develops, an individual becomes what it is during what's called generation in the medical theory of the time, which means conception and gestation, and also during later after birth when one eats for growth. And I'm going to be developing some of these ideas. So those are the pillars of the project, and the project is huge, and basically I'm working on a book. What I'm going to be introducing here are just some of the kind of basic thinking points. There's no time for me to do more than that. So these are my primary sources: Inquisition, kind of record rules. Those are papal rules, papal documents. Letters, literary text, medical treatises, etc. You will see that. This is just by way of introduction, a volume of the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the songs of Mary, by Alfonso X's workshop. I will be discussing some of the miniatures in a minute, just so that it's not all text and heavy thinking here. The first thinking point is the idea or the concept of raza itself and the word. During the time, we see various documents talking about raza, or another spelling raza with a civil, which Spanish had Old Castilian had. In the dictionaries, and a lot of it appears in dictionaries, animal husbandry treatises, gemology, and also popular text, poetry, as meaning a blemish or a fault. It is hypothesized that it comes from the lost radia, so which would in Spanish give raya or raja, and so it can be a hairline crack. It's a hairline crack or a crack in the hoof of the animals, a hairline crack in gems. It's also there's a wider semantic field that associates raza with stains or with faults in the weave and in other things. And so that's that is something that I need to take into account when reading the text on raza and interpreting what they mean, because the term will be used to discriminate against certain minorities later on in the 16th century. We will see that. One important text. Everybody here reads Spanish? Okay. So this is one of my sources. This is a chronicle of the 15th century by somebody who's claiming to be writing a chronicle of the reign of Isabel and Fernando, the Catholic monarchs, and he describes the problems surrounding the conversion population. The conversions are converted Jews, so Jews that converted into Christianity. This was a substantial population by the end of the 15th century. The first wave of conversions had happened in the late 1400s after some pogroms or some ritual killings of raids in the Jewish quarters and massive killings of Jews. As a result, many of them converted. And then, of course, after the Inquisition and the Edict of Expulsion, and before that, the establishment of the Inquisition, there were also many other conversions. So this created a new weird group that were the conversos. And the conversos are a really good group to think with because they really challenge the taxonomies of the time. I mean, who are these people? Okay? They're not Christian, they're not Jewish, and so it really exposes what the thinking at the time was about what constitutes an individual, and also what constitutes belief, which at the time went hand in hand. So the text that I have highlighted there in bold is the one that I want us to focus more on. The whole thing is really a really interesting and kind of almost shocking read. But so the conversions is linking the conversions to the Jews, as was often done, and they said that they were so greedy and such gluttons that they never stopped eating according to Jewish custom dishes and pots of Alefinas. We'll be talking more about those in a little bit. The Sabbath stew, dishes of onions and garlic fried in oil. So fried in oil was a marker for Jews and for Muslims because, of course, Christians would be cooking in an animal fat, which was better smelling and more delicious, according to the sources. And they cooked the meat with oil, which they used instead of salt pork, so tocino. I translated as salt pork. Tocino didn't mean at the time bacon, it just meant salt pork. So any type of preserved pork, even like ham, could be tocino, or preserved pork, any part could be tocino. Salt pork and fat, so as to avoid using pork. And the meat cooked in oil and all the other things that they cooked caused terrible breath. And likewise from their homes and doors emanated a terrible stench because of all those dishes. So food changes the body and in a way that is detectable, which is important because oftentimes conversions were not easily detectable, but that's another story visually because they had transitioned to being Christian, so they no longer had to wear any distinguishing marks like the Jews. So they emanated horrible stench because of the dishes, and they themselves smell like the Jews because of all this food and because they were not baptized. Okay, so if they were conversions, they really were baptized. And even assuming that some were baptized, so he's anticipating my argument, well, they were baptized because they were conversions. Since nudity and Judaism deadened the character of baptism in them, they read like the Jews. So this is interesting because nudity, what is nudity? Right, baptism is, it imprints an indelible character, and it's non-negotiable, or is it? This is just by way of getting out of the heavy text block, some illuminations from the Cantigas, and these are just some kind of stereotypical ways of depicting Jews at the time. The thing in the background is not as swastika, okay? It's just a different sometimes there's questions about that. So normally the way the Jews were depicted are the pointed hats, the profile with the sharp nose, and normally eyes that are almond-shaped and they're kind of close together and they always look really mean. And that's it's not my interpretation. That's always the way they are described and the way people have described the way they are depicted. And this I forgot to say, these are Jews
exercising usury, and just another stereotypical Jewish profession. And this is a Jewish apothecary, boticario, who is also another stereotypical Jewish profession, who's selling these spices. And this is interesting because later on, when the statutes of Creed of Latin, which I will be referring to later on, Jews were banned from performing any professions that had to deal with food or even food handling. I mean, it wasn't really about, one of my arguments is that this is not really about ritual, Jewish ritual, that Jewish ritual as a marker of Judaism. It's about pollution. You couldn't touch food because it would pollute that food for the Christians. Now, this is the power of baptism according to the Cantigas, and what we see, and this is not the only instance where that can be seen, is this is a depiction of conversion of a Jew and baptism. And so baptism, because it changed the person from inside and out and outside in, normally actually changed the person physically. And this is not only with Jews. There's also the depiction of Muslims and other people changing. And so normally they become white, and their features, the distinguishing features, are lost. So they are depicted like any other Christian person. So then, who is a Jew? Who is a Christian or a converso? There started because this group was so problematic. There was a lot of talk about who they were and could they did baptism, as Bernalde, the quote that we've seen before, did baptism really take on the Jews or didn't it? So there were various ideas surrounding this polemic that were shared both by people that defended the converted Jews and said that yes, they were baptized and therefore were Christian, and the people that said no, baptism just bounced off of them and it didn't take. Then there were new distinctions that were being created between, and so there were new ways of referring to this phenomenon. And so they talked about baptized Jews or Christians by nature, which were the ones that the people who were not of Jewish descent, that were of Christian lineage. And so then we're starting to see belief being coded as something that lies within the body and more concretely in the blood, which is the one that conveys the qualities of the person throughout the body and preserves that identity. I also want to. I'm also seeing that the notions of cleanliness and stain that were coded in the language as ratza appear as linked to baptism, and so you have to understand that baptism, and I'm reading a lot about baptism. I never thought I was going to read so much about it, but baptism is what it is it erases the original. Everybody is born with an original fault, with an original ratza, right? So we're all like faulty gems, and so baptism really cleans the person from the outside and from the inside. And so there are texts that talk about the ratza that came from Adam, from our first father. And so baptism is a way to clean that. So, but what happens when you're baptized, you really don't believe the Christian dogma, is that somehow you're never really quite washed, and so you remain stained. And what I've seen is that it really becomes a matter of that stain being eradicated not only in the spirit or in the soul, but also in the body, because a lot of these theories really are very materialistic in the end. I'm sure they didn't think about it in that way, but that's what it boils down to. I'm going to be talking about how food plays a part in that. This is just some of the text, one of the texts that I was referring to. And this is what the statutes of purity of blood looked like in the 16th century. So in the 16th century, there was a move to discriminate against Jews, or to leave Jews and Muslims mostly, and heretics, which were basically conversos or relapsed conversos, from entering into some church and state institutions that would give them power. And so the way that is stated is through the word raza. And so then therefore there's been a lot of talk about that raza and those statutes being the beginnings of racism. And so what I'm seeing is that it says that we should not admit as a member to this chapel of the New Kings anybody unless they present proven testimony of cleanliness, because being of the generation of Moors or Jews, or having raza of them, they could send them away. So if they were proven to have this raza, then they could be sent away. Well, what I'm seeing in a lot of the text is that this raza doesn't really mean lineage or generación. It means, which is stated before, it really means a fault or stain of these groups. So the role of food, how does food factor into all this? Well, what happened is that the body was composed of 4 humors. The humors and their constitution, their degree in which each humor was in everybody's body is what made the person different from each other. There were the 4 humors. During the generation, the semen, and both women and men had semen, or the seed, was formed as a result of what was understood to be the 4th digestion. Out of the excess of those certain foods that you have, the semen is formed, and from that semen, the creature the fetus is formed. When after birth, the food continues to feed those humors and continues to make them function throughout the body through the blood. And then that's why a lot of times eating Jewish food, or eating certain foods that were coded as Jewish or Muslim, like eggplant, or having a Jewish or a Muslim wet nurse would be a way to acquire Judaism. And so that's why eating food that had been touched by Jewish or Muslim hands was problematic, or even sharing a meal was problematic, because it was a way to acquire Judaism. It wasn't only a matter of sociability, I think. And my time is almost up. So this is just the theory of humors. It was just very well distributed at the time. And I think I'm just going to end here with the brain diagram and the vein system, which explain how all the foods basically went through the body. The Middle Ages had a lot of emphasis on the vein system, because it was basically the way of conveying foods to the whole body. and of being able to kind of control health and control what was going on with people. And the brain controlled the flow of blood and had a lot of influence, especially in what was called the fourth digestion, which is the one that took place in the different parts of the body. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm out of time, right? So, okay. Okay, so some texts that talk about the role of food are the Book of the Alboraique. The Alboraique is an animal that appears in the Quran. It's the steed that took Prophet Muhammad to the seventh heaven. The Alboraique is a slanderous text that tries to portray conversos as hybrid monsters, and likens it to the Alboraique, presenting the Alboraique as this animal that is a hybrid, that is a composite, as you see, of different parts of the Alboraique have different parts from different animals. One of the things that the Alboraique does is that it eats all sorts of foods. They eat food that is not kosher, that has been killed by Christians or Muslims, which of course wasn't kosher. All sorts of fish, hares, which are not kosher, and alafina, like judíos. Okay, I think I'm just going to jump to this, which is an experiment that I made. So I figured I would try to cook some of these foods. Some of them because I really was trying to understand why certain food, I understand why a food is or isn't kosher, or practice is or isn't kosher, but there were a lot of foods that were not really kosher or non-kosher, right? I mean, that, you can eat that and not be Jewish, right? And so I was trying to understand why some of these foods were being coded kosher. And so this is the alafina, which is a Sabbath stew. A lot of people see it and go, oh, it's like cocido, and it is. It's very similar to dishes, to what kind of one-pot meals that are cooked in a lot of parts of really the Hispanic world. It has legumes, it may have some animal protein, at least eggs, and some other vegetables. Another food that was coded Jewish was meatballs. And so sometimes albondiguillas was, if you ate albondiguillas or little meatballs, that was enough to make you Jewish. Another thing was the almodrote. Another dish was almodrote, which is this eggplant. An eggplant is probably the most, in medieval medical years, the most vile vegetable, because it has a lot of bad phlegm, and it increases the phlegm in your body, and it just makes you a bad person. And so almodrote is, of course, a dish with eggplant, and it's cooked with a sauce of cheese. I made with manchego there, and garlic, and it was really good. One last thing that I made and that I really couldn't understand is this cecina de ensarón, or like cured goose or duck ham. It's like, why is that? Everybody was eating that, but somehow just eating that was a Jewish marker. And so when I made it, basically it's preserved. I made it with duck breast, and it's preserved and cured in salt. It's just basically buried in salt for many days. I don't know how, I forgot about it in my fridge. It was there for a long time. And then when I cut into it, I realized, of course it's a marker, because what it is, I mean, what does it look like? It looks like, okay, I'll answer my own question because we're out of time. It looks like jamon, right? I think it looks like ham. And so it's a marker because it was supposed to be a passing food, right? A food that could help you pass for a Christian, when really you were trying to eat Jewish foods. Well, this is I think that's all I have time for. And I'm happy that you read the article, because this was just a few ideas that I wanted to share with you about some of the thinking points that for my big project. So thank you for your.
Well, first place, thank you for the invitation. In second place, well, I have to apologize with you because my presentation is not as beautiful as Ana Maria, and my English, well, it can be better. So sorry about that. I'm going to talk about chicken, poultry in the New Kingdom of Granada, that more or less is what is today Colombia, as you can see. And these are the provinces and governments that I wrote in the article. Chickens have been studied. Marcy Norton has a beautiful article about chickens, and Felipe van der Mellen, Brazilian anthropologists, have a magnificent book about chickens. But in general terms, chickens and poultry hadn't had the same bibliographical impact than other kind of animals in this ecological imperialism, producing crossbreed words. What is a shame, because chickens, well, did not transform ecology and geography in the same way that sheep or pigs or cows, but they had a major impact because they reached all kind of homes in the New World, from Spanish people to Indians, black people from all kinds of colors. But here I'm going to talk about the Indians because it's interesting the way it changed relations, consumption, and ways of life. The introduction of chickens is related strictly with taxes. The taxes that Indians had to pay to encomendero and derivatively to the crown, but mainly to the encomendero. It was very fast established that they had to pay they had to pay 2 chickens per year, every taxpayer. That means every Indian between 17 and 55 years, more or less. They should give 1/2 in San Juan, St. John's party, and the other hand in Christmas Day, with all kind of paybacks they should pay in common day. And that was like very well established since 1555. And from now on, you can see me here, that was more or less the way it was established. But they also had to pay to the priest that was with them evangelizing chickens. And it changed. In the beginning, they had to give 10 chickens, 5 hens and 5 roosters weekly. That was an amazing number. I mean, that priest ate a lot. Ate a lot. But it changed in 15 years, and the number was 3 chickens per town. But the number of eggs arose exponentially, and I will try to show you here. Eggs in the beginning were 12 every fast day, and after that 20 every fast day, and it goes even to 60 and 40. Well, I think it's interesting. Well, evidently the eggs were not as big as today, as one of the papers read suggested, but well, it's an incredible number even for a tiny expo, 60x something. But what I think is interesting in all this is the Crown decided that this was the Indians had to pay a singular part of the tribute, but also how they have to give it to the priest. And very early, since 1590s, there was a president of the Audiencia, Antonio González, and he established that the encomenderos only could buy the chickens, they only could receive the chickens they needed for their homes, or more or less. If they buy more in order to sell them, in order to sell in the market, well, they could lose the encomienda for 2 years. So this thing that it looks like a detail is not a detail, because it's break the monopoly that encomenderos had over indigenous population, and they are putting indigenous in the market in order to sell all the chickens they are having the rest of the Spaniards or the population. And this is well, one of the things that you could see in the article, but I want to find the cursor. You see this one? At the beginning, it's not clear the size of the hen houses. I mean, it's not determined. The Indians, they received every town 12 hens and 1 rooster, but for all the town. I mean, this is a gift for you. Go ahead, enjoy it. But, well, like every Spanish present in this time, well, it was a poison gift, because it was the idea they had to return a lot. So, but in the first stipulation that we have how a hen house should be is 1573, Ordenanzas y Descubrimientos de las Nuevas Poblaciones y Pacificación, that Felipe II, and it's for a Spanish population, but it says every single Spaniard, every single neighbor, vecino, should have 6 hens and one rooster. Well, this is for Spaniards, but in almost 30 years later, Indian taxpayer should everyone have the same amount of chickens that a vecino. But this is the moment, look, this is the moment and we realize that they are establishing a pattern for paying taxes, but that's not the important thing because they have been paying taxes for 50 years. But this is for the market. You are going to the market, so every one of you should have 6 hens and 1 rooster. Except caciques y capitanes. They should have 10, 1. If not clear the reason, it can be a hierarchical reason, state reason. It's not clear, but I assume that's a kind of problem. The thing is, like 30 years later, there is a visit, and the same logic that is established in this visit keeps for the people, but not, I mean, all of them have 6 1 and the other have 10 1. But in that case, it's not clear if it's because are caciques or not. It's more like the market is working with them and is breaking the hierarchical state logics, and they are going for the money because we realize they have mares and other kind of animals, and they are having service for the Spaniards and everything. But in the same Balcarce in 1635, well, he said, no, from now on, 12-1. and once reinforced the idea, you have to have a lot of chickens for in order to sell them to the travelers mainly, but also to the towns, cities, mines, all the what we could call the colonial system that has to be fed, but it's not by the Spanish, by the encomenderos, but in a straight way. So, just for fun, think in a town of, I don't know, 80 Indians, 80 taxpayers. It would be like 200 people, more or less. That would imply that they have almost 1,000 chickens around, without thinking in the amounts of eggs and the little chicken. I think if you were not taking care, you could step on, and in a simple walk you could step on 5, 6, 7, or 8 chickens, because that would be amazing, because the hen houses are not as we thought about. I mean, they don't have anheos. Sorry, I don't know the word in English, but they don't have nets in order to restrain the animals. So the animals were more or less free around the town. Well, what is interesting, I mean, yes, the Indians have chickens. Wow, you say something, well, no, but I think the interesting thing of this is the change that produced them, and especially the way they get into the market, because, well, they sell. What they are buying with the sales? Well, they are buying clothes. What kind of clothes? Spanish clothes. I mean, naguas, skirts, camisas, blankets, that is a kind of clothes Indians of Altiplano, Bogota, Santa Fe, Tunja used to have previous the arrival of the Spaniards. Well, that barely appears in the sources about what they were buying. So they are buying something that is specifically of a component of the core of Christianity. So you have to wear clothes that are appropriate for a Christian, not for an Indian. And also you have to buy crusade bulls. I mean, it's not very useful, but maybe in purgatory you can use it a little bit more. You have to buy baptisms, weddings, different kinds of ecclesiastical services, and the other thing is tools, but not tools for working corn, for example. Tools for working wheat. It's like they are using these things for being more Christians in a westernized way of life. So, in 1670, Antonio de Guzmán y Céspedes explained his advances in the process of pacification and discovery of Choco, that is like in the Pacific coast. And he reported that around 65 he had established friendly relations with the cacique Don Pedro Daga. And he realized they didn't have chickens. And he said they didn't have because the crowing of the rooster. They didn't want the rooster advised the Spaniards where they were. But also because having chickens is sedentarize your life. You can be around the territory, so you have to establish in one point. And they didn't want that. But he convinced them, and finally they accepted. And they, in that party, 5 years later, they gave them a lot of chicken. So It also reveals how the operation functioned. The hens were not given to the natives as a gift, but as a remunerative, tributary, and trade obligation. For the indigenous people of New Kingdom of Granada, this integration into the model of Spanish life through poultry rearing meant that they not only learned how to work in a particular way, but also how to insert themselves into commercial networks that expose them to greater interaction with non-indigenous groups. This trade offered them access to products in exchange for hens or purchasing capacity with the money obtained from their sale. This market integration transformed consumer patterns and cultural patterns of behavior. With greater product specialization, they progressively lost the habit of producing certain goods which they had previously manufactured for themselves. Clothing is an example of this, for as some records note, what they obtained with the sales of hens was used for the purchase of clothing. The cotton they cultivated was not enough to make their clothes, only for their chinchorros, that is like little fishing nets or light hammocks. It's clear too that the Christian model of the Quran exerted a degree of pressure in terms of dress. There are many examples of other elements that could be obtained with the comfortable afforded by the hens. Breeding and trading poultry represent one side of the colonial system. Not only was a practice imposed, but a network of elements was generated around it, rendering it more complex. Thus, what began as an enterprise to meet tax obligations evolved into an activity that satisfied the commercial needs of Spanish society. Meanwhile, those in charge of rearing this bird had to adopt a certain way of life, with new and increasing needs and demands, the more hens they raised. This was a system of farming that imposed a change that was not only economic and productive, but fundamentally social and cultural. I know you could say, well, but every one other element that was imposed to the Indians had this impact. Yes, but not that much. I mean, for example, sugar cane. Sugar cane changed the world, but the Indians had prohibited working in the trapichos or ingenios. They did it, but it was not an impact in his everyday life for all of them. Wheat was very, very important, but the Spanish America is a huge part is in intertropical lands. Only the coldest one could produce wheat. So change a lot of people, but it didn't change all of them. Plantain had a lot of changes, but the crown wasn't, the plantain is particular because it was not a cultural process directed like this one. This one had an impact and had a target, and well, it was not the same target from the beginning, but it was clear that they looked for transforming Indians' lives. Well, more or less that was. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me. Also, I'm maybe a bit of the odd person out because I'm from an English department.
Microphone, please.
I need the. Not only that. All right. So as I was saying, a bit of the odd person out because I'm from the English department, not the Spanish department. So if I mispronounce Spanish words, you'll forgive me. Anyway, so what I'm interested is in a set of English manuscripts from the 17th century. They're recipe book manuscripts that contain Iberian recipes. With the increased European travel for trade, diplomacy, exploration, and imperial conquest in the 17th century, the movement of people across the European continent and the larger globe was on the rise, and consequently so were the distribution and the dissemination of food. In the age of expansion, travelers were discovering new tastes, new ingredients, and new dishes, and in turn incorporating their foodstuffs into their own cuisines. Records of their gustatory discoveries primarily exist in recipe book manuscripts, or in the period they were actually called receipt books, and I'll talk about that a little bit, why that's the case. It does come from the same Latin root. But these receipt books later became the source material for printed books. So when we look at a manuscript, we're looking at kind of the base material that later gets disseminated more broadly as print material. In general, writers of recipe manuscripts, and these are often women, not exclusively though, included recipes they obtained from family, from friends, and from acquaintances. And these people were either close to home or those that had traveled to new countries or new continents. In some cases, the travelers themselves were often wives and daughters attached to diplomatic families. And they record the recipes they encountered as they traveled to foreign parts and as they came into contact with unfamiliar ingredients and new dishes. The dishes might be indigenous to the particular country, or they might contain exotic ingredients, or they might be completely new recipes that were entering the European kitchen from Asia, Africa, or the Americas. The recipes themselves can give us information about their origins or about the kinds of connections that their writers had in the widening world. Ingredients tell stories, for example, of travels on the spice road from Asia, of slavery in Africa, or colonization in the Americas. How a recipe is written, particularly if it is written using foreign terms or even foreign languages, also reveals specific culinary or medicinal histories and landscapes. Recipes can tell their provenance through the names of donors. And Elaine Long, in her study of 15 English manuscripts from the 17th century, found that roughly 1/3 of the recipes in the collection provided the donor's name. With these notations, we can catch glimpses of a vast network of women and men who participated in the collection and circulation of and the contribution to culinary and medicinal knowledge. Additionally, place names and dates can also appear in recipes, proffering a map and a timeline of where and when ingredients and dishes traveled. To follow the distribution of foodstuffs and recipes that either originated in or filtered through the Iberian Peninsula and then arrived in England, I looked at a particular set of English manuscripts that all have connections with Spain or Portugal. And the first one here is the Granville family recipe book. And it says there, I don't know if you can see it very well, this is Anne Granville's book, which I hope she will make with better use than her mother. So, and that's Mary Granville. So she's saying, I didn't use this very well, and I'm hoping that my daughter will. And this is Anne Dews, that's her married name, Anne Dews Bradley. This is a particularly interesting book because the family had connections with the consulship in Cadiz. And so many of the recipes actually come from sailors or soldiers. It's really a fascinating book, and they often tell where and when they got the recipes. So it's useful for people like me. This recipe book, Anne Lady Fanshawe's receipt book, is a fabulous book. And we know quite a bit about Anne Fanshawe. She was married to Richard Fanshawe, who was the ambassador to Spain and Portugal, also to France and Ireland. And the reason we know a lot about her is that she wrote a memoir of her life. So it's quite interesting to look at the memoir in relation to the receipt book, because sometimes she'll describe something that she ate in Spain or Portugal, and then we later get the recipe. It's not always a one-to-one correlation, unfortunately, but there is a kind of nice way of being able to sort of look at these things from two different sites. This book, the receipt book of Sarah Hughes, is interesting because it's almost half of it's in Spanish, even though it says they're recipes from Portugal, and then the other half is in English. But we don't know anything about Sarah Hughes. She's probably a middling kind of person, and therefore there isn't a kind of history. Aristocratic houses and aristocrats, we have a lot more information about them than we do about sort of the normal everyday person. And we have a lot more recipe books that are written by aristocrats because they're the families who tend to keep records, tend to keep things. So that's, it's often skewed because of the problem of ephemera. The fourth book, or fourth instance, it's really a 10-volume book, is by Edward Montagu, the first Earl of Sandwich. Yes, we know that name for another reason, right? Another food reason. But he replaced Richard Fanshawe as the ambassador to Spain, and with sort of a little bit contentious. But he was incredibly interested in chocolate and the production of chocolate. And in his 10-volume journal, he writes a 31-page section on chocolate. And one of my favorite things is this fabulous drawing of the man grinding chocolate. And I know there are a lot of chocolate people in the room, so and I'm going to talk about chocolate too, so I'm fascinated by it as well. Unfortunately, this is the only one I haven't seen in its entirety because it's owned still by the family. And so another scholar wrote an article about it, and I've been in contact with her, but I haven't been able to actually see it. So hopefully someday I'll be able to go to Naperton House in Dorset and see it. So the manuscripts have what I'm calling trans-border recipes, and they give us a glimpse into the political, cultural, and colonial histories that illuminates the relationship between and among the Iberian Peninsula, England, and the expanding globe through the medium of food. This history, however, is not one that reveals decisions at the highest level of state, although as you can see there's a connection with the highest levels of state, but rather it is a domestic history that nonetheless is part of what drove Europe's desire for new tastes and resources. As these trans-border recipes travel from Iberia to England, or sometimes from the New World, Africa, Asia, to Spain or Portugal, and then to England, they reveal the transmission of kitchen techniques, household practice, medical knowledge, and culinary taste. Trans-border recipes work to transform the bodies on which they act, and I think this is what we've kind of been hearing a little bit from, certainly from Anna Maria, this idea that the body changes. So that the Iberian and sometimes global culinary, medicinal, and cosmetic recipes are literally absorbed into English bodies, changing cultural expectations and physical circumstances. And here I'm going to actually, next one, divulge a bit, or take a little side trip from my paper, because I like to talk also about the methodology, because it's a sort of a group effort. I'm a founding member of the Early Modern Recipes Online Collective. This is a group of scholars that began in 2012, and it is our mission to take early modern, that's basically 16th through 18th century English manuscripts, and transcribe them so that they will become available in a searchable database. And the way we have been doing this is we are working with the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and their early modern manuscripts, online manuscripts, their MO program. And almost all of us are teachers, and so we use this as both pedagogy and also crowdsourcing. So we teach our students how to transcribe, we teach them how to read the paleography of the early modern period, and then they transcribe recipes. We also have what's called a transcribathon, and you can see we're actually in the basement of the Folger there. And these are, we do this at least once a year in the fall. We have transcribers from all around the world. We decide on one recipe book, and we transcribe all day long, and we get the whole book done. It's quite exciting. And finally, after all this time, just now we've been able to have the searchable database. I think we now have 10 recipe books that are searchable. You can go to lunafolger.edu. This is the Folger's search site. And if you want to read more about it, the MROC blog is down there. And right now the blog post that's up concerns the new searchable database. So I want to tell you also a little, I want to show you the secrets behind the transcription, which I think are really cool. The Folger has what's called their transcription program, which is called Dromio. Because there's a kind of twinning, if you know Dromio. So this is what it looks like. So you'll have a picture of the manuscript, and this is Fanshawe's manuscript. And then you get this little box that comes up, and you get to type in the box. And I'll give you a little picture of the box. And the tabs up there, some of them are shortcuts, some of them are ways of tagging. So that you could tag, for example, if a word is superscripted or something like that. Yes, and it's Francisco Moreno's way of perfuming skins, if you want to know. So one of the great things about this, when we first began, we had to know coding, which, you know, I wish I knew more coding, but also I don't really want to know more coding. So, but the great thing about this transcription program is you need to know almost nothing about coding. You can just write regular English. It's enough to be able to learn paleography, which is hard enough. But you can look at the XML, and sometimes, once in a while, you have to go in and fix something. So that's the XML. Those are the two pictures there. To get back to the paper more generally, I want to talk about that there are sort of three categories of recipes and receipt books. Of course, there's the culinary. That's when you're going to expect food and drink. Medicinal recipes, and I have to thank Anna Maria for sort of talking about the humors, because in this period, food and medicine are really part and parcel of the same thing. So the body, it's the galenic system, so what you eat is going to make you healthy or unhealthy. I think this is an idea that's coming back. And that often medicinal recipes, not exclusively, but often they are composed of foodstuffs. So they don't really they may know the difference between a food and a medicinal recipe, but they don't really distinguish it in the same way we do. So those are kind of, sometimes they're very mixed up. And finally, there are household recipes, and in part because this is a household manuscript. So what do you need in the house? Well, you need cleaning supplies. You can't just go to Walmart. You need pesticides, you need dyes, you want perfumes. You need ink to be able to write the manuscript, and you want cosmetics. One of my favorite things to look at is the ink recipes, because of course you need ink to write the manuscripts. I'm always curious about this. And ink recipes appear often, not always, in manuscripts. The Granville family recipe book has 5 of them. 3 of them are related to Spanish sources. They're either in Spanish, they have a Spanish source, or they say the Spanish way. So here are some of them. I know I'm kind of going through them quickly. It's hard to see, but and there's the transcription of them from Dromio. So the other thing I like to do as a teacher is to make things with my students. And so this is another one from the Granville family recipe. This is more of an English one. It's made with beer. You can either make it with beer, wine, or water. Water goes bad very quickly. You need something acidic. So the beer one, you don't have to cook for a long time, so that's the one I usually use. So these are the ingredients. You need beer vinegar, that's basically beer and vinegar. You need oat galls, which are the little round balls there, and in the jar there, it's all smashed up together, and rainwater. And you need gum arabic, which is the resin there on the left, and what they are calling copperas, but what we would call ferrous sulfates. Those are the ingredients, the main ingredients of ink. There are some variations, but that's sort of the main thing. And here I'm with one of my students. I actually just did this on Monday as a workshop, so it's a really messy thing to do. It's really indelible. But there's a magic moment when that brown gunk, when you pour in the ferrous sulfide, that turns black. So, if you're in chemistry, you might know why that is, but anyway. We also make quills, and then they practice early modern alphabet, the secretary hand. And it's hard to write with a quill and ink. It's really hard. And that's kind of a nice thing to realize how difficult writing was in this period. So moving to a medicinal recipe, this is again in the Granville family. I'm particularly interested in this one because, first of all, it is all food stuff. And secondly, the kind of provenance. So it says Captain Phelps of Bristol, his receipt given to, I think, or in something, John Emily, and that's, I think, a brother, in Cadiz, the month of January 1687, for the voiding of gravel stones experienced upon him. Self. So this is like for kidney stones. And at the bottom, you get said Phillips learned and procured from the Moors when he was a slave in Barbary, then much tormented with the said pain, till he applied this remedy, which under God did cure him. So, often you're never going to find who these people are. So I had one of those woohoo moments when I actually found out who Captain Phillips was. I looked for him in the Dictionary of National Biography, and turns out, there he is. His name is spelled differently, but he wrote an account of his experience of being captured as a slave, like Cervantes, he, unlike Cervantes, he was not able to get out by a ransom. He actually had to escape, and it's quite a harrowing story. He doesn't talk about his kidney stone problem here, but of course we know about it from the rest of the book. Okay, I'm finally getting to food. This is Anne Fanshawe's receipt book. This is for pavlova, which is a sponge cake, and if you have been to Portugal or Spain, you probably had this. I also, that is my cake there. We made that also in class, or I made it for class. And this is interesting because it's got the English version and then the other version in Portuguese, Spanish. You tell me. And the Portuguese, yes, okay. So this is the recipe that has so many eggs. It has like 20 eggs, I think. And this is where I do really think, it does take a lot of eggs for leavening because they're not using any kind of baking soda or baking powder that isn't invented until the 19th century. And they're whipping it by hand. But I do think it's also smaller eggs because, 20th century has made eggs really large. The most sort of, one of the things, before we get to the Victorian sponge, one of the things that's interesting to me about this is that it travels to Japan very, very early. The Portuguese take it to Japan. You can still go to coffee shops in Japan and have Castile cake, or what they call pezura. And so it's very much like this recipe. But the Brits, in their British form, they decide to anglicize it by adding cream and fruit for the Victoria sponge cake in the 19th century. That's what happens with that. Okay, I'm gonna end my talk with chocolate because I know that there's so many people here. Everybody loves chocolate, and lots of scholars here are interested in chocolate. And the other thing that's significant to me is that each of the 4 manuscripts that I'm looking at here have recipes for chocolate. That's really the one thing that is a through line, and certainly they're not the only ones. Chocolate shows up really very, very frequently. Kate Loveman, and she's the scholar that I discovered the Earl of Sandwich's work. She writes, having one's own recipe for chocolate was a sign of connoisseurship. I can't say it. But in having itself, just making up the beverage was recognized as something of an art. Recipes for chocolate and methods of preparing it were exchanged for money, but also as gestures of patronage and friendship. And here are a couple of this is the chocolate I've made from the bean, and I have a little teacup, China teacup there because Anne Fanshawe specifies you should serve it in a China cup. There are 12 recipes in Syracuse, and these are 2 of them. Typically, there are 2 kinds of recipes. The kind of recipe that takes the cacao bean and processes it into like rolls or little balls of chocolate that you can then grind. And then the recipes that take that ball or roll and you make it into the chocolate drink. And in this period, it is only a drink. And it also comes into the culture as medicinal. It's supposed to be healthy. That's why it's able to translate into European culture. It comes in as medicine and it stays for taste. The Granville family has one. It has 1,000 cacao, which is, it's a pretty big recipe. And it is for the processing. Here's Anne Fanshawe. This is maybe my favorite recipe of all time, and in part because it has this fabulous sewn-in drawing. And it says, this is the same chocolate sherry pot that they made in the Indies, and it has a moy meal right there. And unfortunately, it's scribbled out by somebody hated chocolate. One of my graduate students was able to transcribe it, so kudos to her. She was able to blow it up really big. That's the great thing about working with digital manuscripts, that you can do that. But the end of it says, the best chocolate but that of the Indies as made in Sevilla in Spain. And there is a date on this too. Yeah, Madrid, 10 August 1665. So this is the King's recipe for chocolate ice from the Earl of Sandwich's journal, and of course this would be the King of Spain. It's an interesting recipe because it is basically for, it's not ice cream, but it's like a gelato, a chocolate gelato. And there are from the 17th century recipes for ice. There are ice houses. King James, for example, had an ice house. And Robert Boyle writes about this in his experiments. Let me see, let me find what the name of it is. It's Experiments and Observations Touching Cold from 1665, so it's a kind of use science to think about freezing using salt. But this is the first recipe that I found that has chocolate in the ice. So that's a kind of new innovation with this recipe. So of all the Iberian recipes that appear in these English manuscripts, those for chocolate have had the longest global effect. Though the exact recipes may have changed, chocolate as a substance and as a malleable experimental ingredient, as it is said in this set of recipes, continues to dominate global taste for both. I have retailers and consumers, but I want to say also restaurateurs and chefs certainly, and really just for everybody, because I think we all love chocolate. And even as these recipes for chocolate are the most extreme example of trans-border exchange and dissemination, all of them demonstrate how the transmission of knowledge, whether it be culinary, medicinal, or household, through the vehicle of the humble recipe, can and does change desires, body chemistries, health, economies, and cultures over the course of time and throughout the map of the world. And I want to finish with just showing my graduates. We have usually a big party at the end where we make early modern recipes. This was in one of my students' houses, actually. So we were all cooking together, and this was our early modern feast. And actually that dish in the front is Anne Fanshawe's adobe beef, or adobe pork, sorry. So that's also one of the Spanish recipes. That's it.
So we have good time for questions of our three speakers.
Professor Saldarriaga, during the Reconquista in Spain, there was this grandes poblados, these areas that needed to repopulate. And the request of the royals in that area was always for eggs, because that was proof that women lived in the area. because, that raising chickens is always a problem. So I wonder if that was just an old Spanish law that then got applied to the Americas, or a Spanish tradition of doing things that way. That was a kind of proof that these areas were, there was a certain number of women who lived in the area.
Well, I appreciate that too, because I was not aware of it. And I would say there is only one difference. You're saying this is women exclusively, or mainly. In this case, in the New Kingdom, in the Indies, it was men, because the pay tax was exclusive for men. So that was a big consequence. But indeed, I think there is a continuity, because even in the Reconquista, there is something similar a la encomienda, because they were giving people to the novel as far as I'm concerned. So I will have to check that through. This is very interesting. Thank you very much.
I have a question for Adam Rea. I love your paper. Well, I'm just curious, can a converso ever really convert?
Well, some people say no. Some people say you can really never. If you're Jewish, you're always Jewish. There's no way.
Because then it seems like, well, what's the point? I mean, I know you don't have to answer this, but
No, and that's exactly one of the issues that went into the discussion. Yeah, what's the point? And a lot of conversos actually walk to the Pope, and so sought his help in trying to persuade these people that there was a point. It's just a very, very complex issue. But I think what I'm seeing is that toward the end of the 15th century and definitely the early 16th, etc., what's happening is that those identities are being kind of institutional. The push to having them be institutionalized is really strong. And medicine also as an institutional practice, in the sense that it was regulated, by state institutions, and the church helped, and also various civil institutions helped institutionalize basically what the body was, and who the conversos were. And by extension, I think everybody else.
I have a bit of a follow-up. I was really interested in the discussion of gender within that passage too, and that it's emphasizing that the women are being following these practices, that they're consuming. And I was wondering if that's because they're involved in preparing the food as well. It's not just consuming it and men consuming it, but it's the women who are managing the household, and they're kind of this source of corruption. Or how do you read that?
Yeah, no. I think that definitely in terms of food preparation, normally the men were in charge of the slaughter. This is very
right for the rabbis.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the women were in charge of food preparation. So women were very suspect of being active agents in all of this. And there's some studies done on the role of women in food in gifted Judaism.
Yeah, I want to also comment a little on this question about the convertibility of the Jewish body or anybody, which is there's much a comment as a question, but I thought you reminded us very well of the way in which the embodiment was also something that was quite changeable, that something could be an embodied condition, but that didn't mean that it was unchangeable because of precisely, as you were showing, the way in which diet and the humors can change the body. So I think that then the Jewish body and the Islamic body become examples of these really difficult cases, in a sense, that you can say, because the Jewishness is seen as being something that's rooted in the body. It's absolutely rooted in the body, but that's not quite the same as saying it can't be changed, right? I mean, it's all of that oily aubergine that's making those Jewish bodies, partly, right? So even the people who are deeply convinced that there's something embodied about Jewishness aren't necessarily saying that that means it can't be changed.
So my question is related to the oiliness, I guess, of Rebecca's comment. And this is for you, Amy, and I think it touches on a little bit of what you've developed, Ana Maria. What attitudes did these writers of recipe books in your period of study express toward these Iberian recipes? And I ask because travel writers from England in the 19th century had terrible things to say about Spanish cooking. That the oil was just everywhere and was burning, and the flavors were too strong, and any kind of refined palate could simply not eat it. Yeah. And so it really expressed this kind of disgust that I heard echoes of in your presentation on the Maria.
Yes, I think that's true. I think you see it in depictions, fictional depictions of Spaniards, for example, and smelling of garlic, for example. And even, so Anne Fanshawe will say something like, as you like, the Spanish ways to do it with garlic and cilantro or something like that. And so it's clear that she's somebody who is adventuresome and has accepted this and embraced the Spanish aspect of cooking. But probably, generally speaking, it's not acceptable. And I think, really probably until the 20th century. Even then, right? I mean, later in the 20th century, where, I think it seems to be that it becomes more, the other people can speak to this, but it just, just from my personal knowledge, it just seems like later in the 20th century where you get some Spanish. You could say more. I know you're making this.
No, I'm channeling the big expert.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm having trouble process.
Yeah, I don't entirely agree. I think it's really a mixed bag. There's a lot of these negative perceptions, but there's also very positive attitudes towards what Spain contributes to European cuisine, particularly in like the olla podrida.
Yes.
I recently wrote about that, and Barbara, you might be able to chime in. San Pepes, for example, right, has this beautiful recipe for the olla podrida.
Oh, yes.
There's many English recipes that really praise that as this incredible contribution.
I absolutely agree. I think it's called hodgepodge.
And the French as well, yeah.
So I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a mixed bag of that, where some things are acceptable,
Right.
and some are
And there's
not.
also hostility. I agree with that.
Yeah, you even see that in chocolate, right? And so there's the Spanish way, and then there's the healthy way. And there's the English way, the really distinct ways.
Did it move farther north? Do you find these in the German cookbooks? It might be in Mark's Rumpole. He had room for a lot.
He's got olla podrida. Rumpholz has an olla. Yeah. Whole potrita.
He was ready to go where no man had been before.
He has a recipe for beaver.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah, I do. I wanted to continue this discussion, which seems so fruitful, about raza, or raza, as you say, and it's changeability, because it seems like maybe in a similar way, there's some people who think it's changeable and some people who think it never can. I mean, no matter what, it seems like that's one of the things you're arguing, right, in your paper, is that for certain people, if you're a converso, you're never going to really be a true Christian, and that could be smelled upon you, and that can be found out by the foods you're sneaking in. But I wonder if that person gave up all these so-called shameful or Jewish foods, would they, and they're eating copious amounts of ham and pork, do they get to change the way Rebecca is suggesting, or is that not?
But
does that not happen?
that's the polemic.
Yeah.
I think the polemic is that some people, for a lot of people, you can never stop being Jewish. I mean, if you're Jewish, that's it. And so, and for some other, a lot of people, a lot of both Christians and non-Christians or converted conversos argue, well, what is, and first of all, this isn't Christian. This is, Baptist. If you're baptized, you're a Christian, and this is going against the teachings of the church, and it's going against a lot of other beliefs. And so that's the big claim. And so I think it's useful to see what becomes institutionalized, just because it becomes they are the ones that are able to decide, to make a decision and bear down on those discussions with power. Now, that doesn't mean that those like the statutes of purity of blood are not going to be met with resistance, because they were. And so I think that's one of the fascinating issues, and the polemic. And so within the polemic, I think the polemic exposes what the terms of identity are. And so what I've seen, so I think some of the big, what I call them big pillars, but that, I don't think it's only that, is religious beliefs, is the issue of food because of what, how it's thought to constitute the body, and kind of medical, of course it's all related, medical ideas about the body.
Well, I'm curious if any students were, maybe you're a little reluctant, but if you have some questions that you want to put forward, don't be shy. It's a very friendly group. People would love to hear from you.
Professor Saldariaga, you mentioned that when given the chickens, they were given like 12 hens and 1 rooster. So when they had to pay taxes, did they have to pay like in a certain amount of hens or roosters, or was it just a general?
Well, it was established that it was half and a half, always a rooster or always a hen. And except when they were free, in that case, they don't say how it should be. But usually it was half and a half.
Yeah, I have a question for Anna Maria. One was just on the baptism. You had said that some people got baptized to get rid of the sin from Adam, and some people got baptized, and like in the pictures, it changed their appearance.
So I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Okay, so some people got baptized, and you said that got rid of original sin from Adam and Eve.
That's it.
And then you said with your pictures, the appearance of the people changed when they got baptized. So I was wondering if there was a certain age they got baptized, like if they got baptized early to get rid of the sin, or if they got baptized later in life when they made the decision, or how that worked.
Early in Christianity, people were baptized as adults, and baptism followed indoctrination. I mean, you have to basically take classes and become informed in the beliefs, and then baptism was a way to be admitted into the group. Then later, I'm summing things up here, okay, or complicated. But later on, baptism became coded as the sacrament that imprints the body and the soul. And so then there was more of a push to baptize children as as early as possible. And so in that, the godfather and the godmother are the ones that are accepting the beliefs for the one who's being baptized, because of course that, baby can't really accept or deny any theological truths. So for conversos, there was a range of practices. Some people got baptized as adults, and many of them were baptized as a group. There were forced conversions, meaning that they had to baptize or else. This happened really early on in the Zygothics thing, and maybe this is too much information. And some of them then later baptized their children, or some children. There's stories of wet nurses, absconding with the babies and baptizing them against the will of the family. So there were basically a range of practices. So, but by the 15th century, baptism was considered valid, in terms of from the point of view of the church at any age. The only wrinkle was this, whether it could be nullified by the lack of belief, and that's where the polemic was, because then it constitutes a Christian. That may have been a too long answer.
This kind of may be a silly question, but like for Anna Maria, so you said Jewish people would cook their food in oil, right? And then Christian people would cook their food in animal fat. So can you explain why they would do that?
So lard is just a better fat. Okay. Animal foods in general are supposed to be, better foods. There's this theory of analogy in medicine, and this is oversimplifying, by which you kind of develop, or the body is nourished through the qualities of the food that you eat, and of course there's some foods that are more similar to the human body, and so as a result, in some authors think that pig is the ideal food, because pig is actually, I think there's some kind of anatomic basis for this, more similar to human body. Other authors say it's poultry or mutton, which was the most expensive meat. And so a lard was, and I don't know if we know absolutely all of the reasons, but lard was the ideal food. It was also used to preserve food. It kept really well, and it was more expensive than oil. And so even up to the 15th and 18th century, I've seen cookbooks say, for us poor people, if you can cook it in lard, but if you're poor, you can just cook it in cheaper olive oil. It wasn't supposed to be as nourishing as good for you, and so it was the food. It was a marker for ethnic priorities. In some cases, it could also be a marker for lower social levels, like garlic was also a marker for the peasantry in some circles. It was, I think, Juan D'Avignon, this 14th century medical author, calls it the medicine of the poor, garlic. So eats lots of it.
On that note, let's thank our three speakers and take a break.